Hey folks, how's it going? I just received this email from a viewer of the channel, and it says, "Hey Matthew, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. Our last our conversation went great, basically, and your guide to helping get a job helped me get a new internship as a gameplay engineer at a company, and he wanted to ask what is my advice on what distinguishes a really good coder, and what about specifically a gameplay coder. So thank you so much for writing a question in. I'd be really happy to talk about this topic. I think, once we get on the job, it's all about like, at least for myself personally, once I get the job, I'm like, okay, how can I do a good job? And so that's something that I think we could have a really good time talking about. But just quickly for anybody who, and also thank you for your testimony. I'm definitely going to use that as a testimonial to try and help more people hopefully read my content. But if you're somebody who's watching this channel and you haven't checked out my book already, you can view it at tinyurl.com. And this is basically a guide on how to get an internship. And then I have a sister guide, which is linked within that one, on how to pass the interview if you get an interview. Those guides are currently free, but they won't be for long. So feel free to check them out now while they're available for free. Okay, so here's a bunch of tips that I had just sort of off the dome, thinking about ways that I can give you advice for what helped for me. And the first one I would say is try and get comfortable with surfing. So I guess if you were to summarize this, it's, you kind of want to chase the discomfort, because it's easy, I think, in coding where there's so many different paths for us to get a little bit complacent and focus on something that's working. But if you feel like there's a new task that touches upon something you've never done before, I would encourage you to chase it out and to give it a try. Some of the best coders, I think, in general, are coders who feel comfortable code surfing. So what does that mean? Well, this is an analogy, or maybe it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor from somebody I used to work with. His name was John, and he was a person who created the mini games in Fallout, and now he's like, I think, a tech director at God of War studio. But basically, he told me that, when you jump into a new code base, it's like surfing, in that I think the analogy is implying that you can't bend the water to do what you want it to do, right? The code is designed in such a way, it had a mission in mind, and you've kind of got to chase the swells of the water to try and use it to your advantage, right? Because in a code base, let's say, there's usually a lot of ways to do something, but there's usually only a few ways to do it most efficiently, right? Maybe one or two ways to do it correctly. So you want to maybe be humble and do it the correct way, even if it takes more time to figure out exactly how it's supposed to work with the existing structure. So that's something I would advise. The next thing is think about why. Okay, always when you're looking at the code, especially as a new person or a novice coder, you're gonna want to be asking, why did they do it this way? And I think just that conscientiousness, that presence of taking that perspective and asking is going to help inform you and help you learn as well. So whenever you see something was implemented in a unique way, you should think about why. And slowly, I think you'll start to build a bit of an intuition. There's a little example I wanted to show you here. You may have seen something like this. So here's two different for loops, okay? You'll notice that this one is a little bit weird. It starts, instead of going 0 to less than length, it goes from the length down to 0. So why would an array go backwards? Why would we iterate through an array backwards? Well, I think an experienced coder, this is probably going to stick out to them, because I think there's only one reason why you would do this. And that's if you are removing elements from the array. If you're removing elements from the array, then you're safe. It's not going to resize if you're taking elements from the back, right? You don't have to worry about an element in the front getting replaced with a smart structure like an array list or something like that. So whenever I see this pattern, I immediately think, okay, something's getting removed from the array. And I can kind of infer that. And this is just a little example. It's kind of emblematic of the greater point, which is that slowly over time, you're going to start to see code and you're going to see a little bit how it's structured and you're going to infer a little bit about what's going on there, just from maybe even just a line of code like this. So that's something I wanted to mention, and that will come over time, I think. But that sort of wisdom to, as you say with the surfing, to kind of see out into the sea and see how the waves are moving, and to kind of intuit kind of what the water wants, or what the code wants. I think this speaks to what it means to be a great coder. The next thing I wanted to talk about is time to implement versus big O. So when I was in university, they put a lot of emphasis on space-time complexity, which is very important. And, in the majority of, well, I wouldn't say the majority, but in a lot of places in the code, it's important to think about, well, no, I'll say the majority. In the majority of places in the code, it matters a lot. I mean, almost always it matters how much time an algorithm is going to take, how much space an algorithm is going to take. But what I'm trying to say is that at different times in the project, it may be more or less efficient to just get it done versus worrying about the correct, most efficient method. In our industry, the projects can be a bit like, I'm not sure the right word, but they will get drafted often and then discarded often. And as a result of that, it's not always worth it to invest extra time into making sure every little thing is perfectly efficient. Usually it's best to think about, okay, what's going to get this finished first, and then I could worry about optimizing it later. Early optimization is often like a big enemy that we have to face, especially as people who are new to the industry, because I think in our head we're like, oh, it can be better, so we want to do that and we want to prove ourselves. But you have to be a little bit wise in questioning whether or not it's worth your time. And I think that's something to think about, is that the time to code something is sometimes more important, and I would say usually more important than the space-time efficiency of the algorithm that you're coding. Sometimes it's more important to just get it done. So that's another thing to think about. And I think the trade-offs of time management are going to be something that's students haven't really experienced when they were in university. So how do you get better at that? That's a fair question. And here's what I would recommend to you. Whenever you take a new task within your engine, write down how long you think it's going to take. Then when you're about halfway done, estimate again. And then at the end of the task, look back on how long it truly took and write that down as a third number. So you have the original estimate, the halfway estimate, and the true amount of time that it took. And then at the end of each task, go back and reflect on those three numbers. And simply taking pause and measuring that data, I think you're going to slowly be able to refine your judgment over time. But just make sure that you're doing it. It's not the role of your producer to do that. I mean, yes, he has to do that, but it's also your responsibility for your own growth. So I would recommend you just take the time to estimate and then reflect on how long it took. I think you'll get better at estimating just by doing that. Okay, I have a bunch of 3 quick tips for asking questions. Being a new person on the team, maybe you're an intern, maybe you're a senior hire, but you've just recently joined a team. Asking questions is going to be a big part of what you do in the day-to-day. So here are 3 tips in order to do that most effectively, I think. The first is never ask the same question twice. People hate this. It doesn't matter what the industry is, but people just hate getting the same question twice. So what I would recommend to you is record the answers to the degree that you can. You gotta respect whatever the legalese is in your company, whatever the laws are in your state. But if you could record people with video, that's great. If you want to ask for their permission, I think that's probably best. And then also, if they deny it and they're like, hey man, I don't want you to record this, then I think you have a better, they'll be probably less annoyed perhaps if you have to come back and ask them, because hey, I wasn't able to record it, right? So that's something to think about. Try to write it down if you can, whenever somebody gives you like an explanation of how to do something, or record it. I personally always have OBS open, and I'm always trying to record stuff when someone's giving me a tutorial or something, and then I go back through it step by step. Okay, the next thing is don't ask without showing your work. Whenever you're going to ask a question, first present what you've done so far in order to try and help yourself. For example, hey, how do I open this door? Don't say that. Instead, say, hey, how do I open this door? I've already tried the doorknob, but for some reason it appears locked. I searched around the room for a key, but I couldn't find one. Okay, maybe explain where you were looking, where you were searching, right? Just by explaining the work that you've done so far, I think you're showing that you've put a lot of effort into the question, and respect of that, I think people are more likely to give you effort back, and it's just the right thing to do. So always try to show your work in the question asking. And even if you did work, make sure you always include it in the question because people do want to see that. Okay, and the last question is prevent it from being asked again. I mean, this is ultimately, we talk about two things not to do. This is the thing that you should do is if you're asking a question, then that knowledge was not self-evident. So I would suggest to you to pursue, is there any way that you could make this knowledge self-evident? For example, maybe you could improve your documentation so that, maybe that's a Confluence document. Maybe that's a comment in the code in order to explain the functionality for the next newcomer who's coming. You want to leave the code and I guess whatever it is you're working on in a better state than when you first found it. So that's my advice to you. Okay, so now you talked a little bit about gameplay engineers specifically. Here's my tips for gameplay engineers. First, welcome to the family, right? I'm a gameplay engineer as well, and I love it. It's kind of where my heart is. I guess I'm technically an AI engineer as well right now, but because in my company there's a distinction between AI and gameplay. But that's probably a good place to start our discussion, which is that gameplay is one of the most malleable roles on a video game team, which makes sense. As you can imagine, some video games have very different gameplay, right? Candy Crush's gameplay is so different than The Last of Us. And that's interesting, right? So a gameplay engineer could very realistically work on AI or graphics or animation or design, certainly. Maybe they could work on just doing different data calculations, like calibrating different settings for different weapons and stuff. They might do some fine tuning there. There's a lot, and maybe tools development as well. So there's a lot that a gameplay engineer can do. And I think embracing that is one of the keys to success as a gameplay engineer. We talked a little bit earlier about chasing the discomfort. I think that's only more true for a generalist role like a gameplay engineer. Embrace being a generalist. And if there are opportunities to study something that you haven't studied already, I'd always recommend that you go and check it out in order to gain that breadth of knowledge, especially as a new person. There's great value to that. The next thing I would recommend in particular is leaning into the low-level stuff. So I've worked at a couple of gameplay engineering jobs that have not just involved code. Oftentimes they'll involve scripting or maybe a visual scripting language, such as Unreal Engine's blueprints. And I would encourage you as much as possible to try and go low, go deep with the code into the C++ architecture, into the programming versus the scripting, because that's where, the real talent is at. And that's not to say that you can't, be a very talented scripter, but the best programmers in our industry have always been programmers, okay? And the reason why is because, well, of course, yes, it is harder, but some of the things that you want to do are just only possible if you know the programming. So I want you to keep that in mind. And, I have met some gameplay coders who only feel comfortable in the scripting, and that's really not good. You really want to build that strength and that confidence to go into the C++ code, understand things like pointers and dynamic memory management, and that's gonna be an important, I think that's very important, especially when you try to get a job at some of these other studios, because that's the part that transfers, right? Learning how to connect the different nodes in the node graph, I don't think that's going to transfer as much for the engineering role, because that can vary, for this scripting language versus that one. It's the coding fundamentals that you need to focus on. So I would say lean into the lower stuff. And then the next two kind of go together, is that you should be of service and be humble. Let's talk about being humble first. Gameplay engineering is not a role for, I think, the rock star. Hey, there certainly have been rock star gameplay engineers, but I think that gameplay engineering is, without a doubt, a role that is
it's unique. It's a unique coding role, and it's not a role that kind of operates solo. You're always enmeshed in a team as a gameplay engineer. Gameplay engineering is in the middle of engineering and game design. And so as a result of that, you're kind of like the person on the design team with the superpower of how to code, and you're the person on the engineering team with the unique insight on what the designers need. And you have a bit of a design sensibility as well. If you're a gameplay engineer, you should also be a little bit of a good designer, right? You should be playing games that are in the genre of the game that you're working on. All that stuff helps. But I think it's important to come to the job with the perspective of how am I going to lift the designers up? Everything we do is sort of in support of the designers. I think that's an important frame of mind to be in because I just don't think gameplay engineer is the role where like you're the hero. I think it's a little bit more like you're the support class. And different people have different opinions on that, but I found that the most successful gameplay engineers I've worked with are the ones who are putting their designers first and they're thinking, okay, how can I empower their vision? But your mileage may vary. Okay, and then I've got 4 quick tips. You didn't ask for this, but you said you were going to be an intern, and I've done that many times. I think I was an intern like 14 times or something crazy like that. So here's my advice for an internship. The first thing is try and chase measurable tasks. So there's going to be a lot of tasks that you could take on, but I would highly recommend that to the degree that you can, try to measure your output, try to measure your impact. For example, the task that says I optimize the widget, that's never going to be as good as saying I optimize the widget by 15%. It's always better for you to say the percentage, say, by this many times faster, by this percent faster, decrease spending by this amount of money, increased the monthly active user retention rate by this amount of time, increased the average revenue per daily active user by this amount of money. Try to find the statistics and use those to inform your success because people care about those numbers and the numbers are important. Okay, it can get wishy-washy in the qualitative measurements, but the quantitative stuff, the numbers hold the truth almost always. So I would highly recommend you chase tasks in particular that have a measurable impact. The next is go out of your way to help someone. Try to do this a few times. Talk to designers, especially. That's usually where you can make the greatest impact. Man, I so many times I have talked to non-technical team members and I look at what they're doing and maybe they're dragging this thing over 10 times for every single thing, right? And it's like, you don't have to drag that over. We can create a button to do it for you. And they're like, wow, that'd be incredible. You do it and it makes their day. You're saving them sometimes minutes of the day. In some cases, you might be able to save somebody like an hour of their week or an hour of their day, maybe, with a really good tool. And as a coder, you should feel empowered to create something like that. So I highly recommend you go out of your way to try and help somebody and do something like that. I would also recommend, this is a spicy thing, okay? So don't tell anybody I told this to you. But I would recommend if you're an intern to maybe work a little bit longer than is normal in order to build up those skills, just that little extra amount. The way that I've always thought of it when I'm working on a team is I need to create like 8 productive hours. So if I feel like I was unproductive for an hour, then I'll stay an extra hour to do 9 hours in total, but I did 8 productive hours. And if you're maybe a noob and you feel like you're only operating at 60% efficiency of an average worker, then you might want to do some extra hours to honor the difference there. Now look, I want to be very clear. You don't have to work any longer than your boss is telling you to, right? And finding a comfortable work-life balance is really important. But I think it's also reasonable to expect people to put in extra time at the start of their working job, right? If you're working on a new job, it's going to take a little bit of time to ramp up, let's say. And I would encourage you to try and don't feel ashamed if you feel like it's taking you longer than the average engineer to do a task. That might be very reasonable given that you're an intern and that you're new to the team. And so if you want to put in extra time to do that, then usually I think that's okay. But you can't record it. Otherwise your manager's going to get costed for that pay. He's going to get billed for that. So you might just put in extra time after work or something like that. And hey, You only do what you're comfortable with, but that's what I would do personally. Okay, the next thing is I highly recommend you make friends. It's really important to have friends in life, but also in your industry. And this is something that I'm always working on because I feel like I could come across as pretty annoying sometimes. So I'm always trying to be more friendly. But there's a lot of ways to make friends. I think if people are going to be doing anything in your office, like maybe there's a board game night or they're going to go play kickball, then go join those people and participate in those group activities. I think that's a great start to making friends. Um, and then also just think about the love languages and how you can reach people through different love languages, right? For physical touch, you don't want to get workplace harassment, so maybe don't be touching people, but you can give them a high five, right? So that's something that's appropriate, I think, for physical touch. Gift giving is something huge, right? On your first day of work, go to Dunkin' Donuts, buy 30 munchkins, put them on your desk, send a Slack to the entire team and say, "Hi, everyone. My name is Bob. I'm the new intern on the team, and I just bought a bunch of munchkins to share. Please come on over to my desk when you get a moment today, grab a munchkin, and why not tell me a little bit about yourself because it's a pleasure to meet you." Do something like that, and you get people coming. Coders, they could be a little shy. Sometimes they hide, in the little cubicle or something, and so you got to get them some nice sweets to come out, right? Like Hansel and Gretel. So you could come over and say, "Hello, how are you doing? Here's a little sweet roll for you, Sonny." Right? Do something like that. I think it helps a lot. And then, so yeah, do that for your first day, but also do it just because, right? Just bring in some cookies and say, "Hey guys, I accidentally baked 100 cookies. Would you like some?" Do stuff like that. People really like that. Little snacks and stuff like that. Okay, next, this is the final one I have, is do one-on-ones with people. I highly recommend you seek out different people on your team and ask them to have lunch with you in a one-on-one setting. And then ask them about their career. Ask them about their life. What are their goals? I would highly recommend you ask questions in such a way that it is sort of like supporting their ego, right? They're like the id and the ego. You want to say to them, you want to ask people questions where they feel like they're answering from the first person perspective. So, for example, if you're a new intern and you want to know, "Oh gosh, what can I do to succeed?" then you should ask them, "Hey, when you were just starting out, what do you feel was the best advice you received with respect to how to succeed?" They're more likely to give you an answer to that one that I think will be useful. And then they feel like you're asking about them, which is kind. Something I'm really bad at in one-on-ones is often I'll ask all the questions. So it comes across a little bit like an interview. People don't always like that. So I would say if you can try to make it feel more conversational, I think people enjoy that more. And that's something that I'm always working on. But how would you do that? Well, if somebody says something, then you should give your opinion as well, and then give a brief backstory, maybe like 10 seconds. For example, you ask somebody, "Hey, what would be a great piece of advice that you received in with respect to like, how to get started? How do you recommend to get started?" And then he goes off and he says, "Oh, my mentor, Bob Senior, always said to, polish my shoes before I went for a walk." And then I might say, "Oh, that's fascinating. I've heard the same thing actually. It wasn't from Bob Senior, but my mother was. It would coincidentally happen to be she was a shoemaker, and she constantly was telling me to shine my shoes as well. So I think I've just kind of grown accustomed to that without maybe realizing that was what to do. But yeah, it's interesting because I've seen people without shiny shoes go far in life, and I guess maybe I have part of my journey so far I can credit to that advice. So basically you're just saying, okay, relate their story to your story. You're talking about that perspective, and then it's a little bit more like a conversation instead of saying, "Oh yes, shiny shoes. Next question." Right? People don't like that. So that's a mistake I've made too many times. Okay, those are all my tips on how to succeed as an engineer. Hey, we're all just learning and everybody's got a different perspective, but that is mine. I wish you luck, good sir. Congratulations on an internship job. That's incredible. That's awesome. I hope you learn a lot. And if you do, let me know what happens next. I'm excited to follow you on your career, and I wish you good fortune.